There is a man and there is a woman. The man, his name is Mr. Salt. What's his name?
Mr. Salt.
He is married to a woman and her name is Mrs. Sugar. What's her name?
Mrs. Sugar.
Mr. Salt and Mrs. Sugar, they live together in the salt house. Mr. Salt has a very salty nature. He doesn't mean to, but that's his nature. He's a little bit acrid. How can I say? He's a little bit acid. He's a little bit dry. He's a little bit kind of, He's salt. He loves his wife dearly, of course, but he's just salt. She, like most women, put up with him. What can she do? Mrs. Sugar, on the other hand, is very sweet. Mrs. Sugar is the kind of woman that you would love to have as your neighbor. If you run out of maybe tea or coffee or sugar, or you need a little something, you can knock on her door and she will always say, "Of course." Mrs. Sugar never ever says no. Never says no. Mr. Salt sometimes does not think about what he's saying. Words come out of his mouth without the process leaving his brain, and he just says anything. And Mr. Salt, they say, is like the man who cannot find his trousers even though he is wearing them. You get the picture? Mr. Salt has put something down. For the life of him, he cannot find it. He's looked high. He's looked low. He can't find it. Mrs. Sugar, very sweet. She tidies. She cleans up. And he's thinking, she's moved my stuff. She's always moving my things. Why does she touch my things? Mr. Salt can feel the anger in his belly. Mr. Salt can feel the anger in his chest. Mr. Salt can feel the anger reaching his throat. Mr. Salt has looked high and low and cannot find what he has displaced. Mr. Salt turns to Mrs. Sugar and says, "Mrs. Sugar, you and I cannot live together. No, Mrs. Sugar, that's it. I've come to the end of my tether. Mrs. Sugar, I want you to leave the house, go and find somewhere else to live, and get out." Of course. She looks at him like, you don't really know what you're saying. And he's adamant. "No, you touch my things, you move my things, I can't take it anymore. Leave the place." She is hurt like an arrow in her heart. She goes to her room. She collects some personal items. She wonders, does he truly mean what he says? She puts them in a bag. She stands by the door. She looks at him. "Mr. Salt." She leaves the salt house and she walks out. Over the land, she walks. She can see up ahead. There's like an upside down house. It looks like a sugar bowl house. It's derelict, no one lives there. She says, I can make that place my home. She walks across the land, she looks to the sky, and she asks, Sky, will you cry for me? I cannot cry. If I cry, the tears will cut a line in my face. Sky, will you cry for me? She reaches the upside down house. She enters the house. She sits down by the door. She looks out. She can see in the distance there is the house of Mr. Salt. She can see that the clouds, they come over, they are grey, they form heavy overhead. And before you know it, the wind, it comes. And before you know it, the clouds are heavy. And before you know it, there's the pitter, patter, patter, pitter, 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 patter, patter, pitter. It gushes down, it rains, it's a monsoon. It rains and it rains and it rains and it rains and it rains. And she in turn says, the clouds, they cry for me. And she sits by her doorstep. But what do you think is happening to Mr. Salt's house? It's melting. The walls are saturated with water. And it's melting. Mr. Salt's house is crumbling. Mr. Salt, his roof is crumbling. Mr. Salt, the water is coming. Mr. Salt, he looks through and out of his window. Mr. Salt, he can see up ahead. There seems to be an upside down house, and there seems to be Mrs. Sugar. Mr. Salt says, I'm going to go and speak to my wife. I'm going to ask her to forgive me. I can't help it. I'm Salt. So he puts something over his shoulder, and the house crumbles down all around him. He runs out in the pouring rain. He is wet from the top of his head down to his big toe. He reaches the house of Mrs. Sugar. He asks, Mrs. Sugar, please let me in. I'm getting wet from the top of my head down to my big toe. Mrs. Sugar has never said no, but she says, you're not a nice man. You say things without thinking. Words leave your mouth and you don't have no recourse. You just blurt out words. You hurt people's feelings. Don't you take consideration? And he says, but I am Salt. If I can change my manner and my way, I would. But I'm Salt. Please let me in, Mrs. Sugar. And Mrs. Sugar, she sits there and says, I will only let you in if you agree to live by our rules. Your rules and my rules. We make the rules together. Do you understand? Mr. Salt says, of course I understand. I'm getting wet from the top of my head down to my big toe. Please let me in. And with the pleading, Mrs. Sugar says, okay, come on. He goes into the house, he opens his arms, she opens her arms, they embrace and they kiss. They've noticed now that something is very strange because they cannot separate. They are stuck at the lips. He puts his hand upon her shoulder. She puts her hand upon his shoulder. They tug and they pull and they pull and they tug. And she says, Mr. Salt, you have become wet from the top of your head to your big toe. We will have to wait until you dry off. They wait. And they wait. And they wait. Eventually he dries off and crumbles away from the lips of Mrs. Sugar, and they begin to live in the sugar bowl house, and life is good. But there's always that day, there's always that nature of nature. Mr. Salt has put something down. For the life of him, he can't find where it is. Mr. Salt can feel that anger, that anxiety, that frustration in the bowels of his belly. Mr. Salt can feel that anger, that frustration beating in his chest. Mr. Salt, he can feel that anger reach his throat. He wants to tell Mrs. Sugar something terrible. Mr. Salt, he can feel the words coming out of his mouth. But before he speaks, he licks his lips. He says, And what do you think Mr. Salt's lips taste of? Sugar. And so Mr. Salt finds himself saying, my darling and my tender love, the sweetheart of my youth, I ask you, please, I've misplaced something, and if you have the time, can you help me to locate it? She says he doesn't usually talk like that. Mrs. Sugar usually stops what she's doing and she goes to his aid. But before she speaks, she licks her lips. And what does the lips of Mrs. Sugar taste like? And for the first time, Mrs. Sugar hears herself saying, listen, you're a grown man, you haven't got a nappy on, I'm doing something, I can look after you when I finish, but right now, take care of your own self. You're not a boy or a child. Oh, I don't usually talk like that, she says. But together, they live happily ever after. Because Mr. Salt understands the true nature of Mrs. Sugar, and Mrs. Sugar understands the true nature of Mr. Salt. And with that understanding, they both live happily ever after in the upside down sugar bowl house. I thank you.